So thank you for coming to Genealogies of Experimental Fiction. First, we will have Beth Jensen from Georgia State University, who will be presenting on celibacy, sexuality, and nature in Cather's A Lost Lady. Then we have Susan Vanderborg from University of South Carolina, presenting on Spectacularizing Debt in Kentucky Route Zero, Interactive Fiction's Staged Gameplay. And lastly, we will have Jason Wang of Toronto Metropolitan University present on the financial crisis and home ownership in Jade Chang's The Wangs versus the World. So we are going to start with Beth, and Beth was saying that they are in Atlanta, so kind of traffic is ridiculous, and so there's been a 2-hour traffic jam, and so Beth is live from their car. So I think,
Yeah.
are you going to keep your video off just to just minimize distraction?
If you don't mind, because you're
That's
just
fine.
going to be looking up at me. If you can
Yeah,
hear me, is that acceptable?
absolutely. Yeah, you're very clear.
Oh, okay, all right. And again, I'm presenting from a car, so thank you for your patience. It's challenging. Let's see. Well, my paper on Willa Cather's A Lost Lady. Many readings of Willa Cather's A Lost Lady allude to either Neil's self-imposed celibacy or to Marian's overt sexuality. Others focus on the role of nature, particularly the floral imagery prevalent throughout the novel. No reading, however, intertwines the dominant theme of celibacy, sexuality, and nature. The two central characters in the novel react differently to their surroundings. Marian's sensuality is often reflected in the lush landscape of the marsh. Neil's inhibitions, on the other hand, manifest in his many awkward encounters with nature. He seldom interacts successfully with the physical world. As a non-romantic, he finds no comfort in the great outdoors. Appropriately, he is an architect. He creates walls both figuratively and literally to protect himself from the physical world. Neil cannot accept his sexuality when it bubbles to the surface. Marian, on the other hand, cannot exist when hers is repressed. In A Lost Lady, nature in its various form serves as a gauge of both Marian's and Neil's psychological development or lack thereof. Though several scenes emphasize the eroticism in the novel, two pivotal encounters center around the image of the marsh. Sexuality first emerges in the novel when a group of adolescent boys, including Neil, journey to the marsh to fish. After receiving permission from Mrs. Forrester to wade down in the marsh, a request they hesitate to make, they walk quietly around the house and through the gate. Once free of gates and restraints, however, they run shouting down the grassy slopes. They descend at first a round hill that slopes gently, yet the bucolic setting evaporates quickly as the land breaks precipitously. The boys, however, are determined to reach the marsh as their excitement mounts. Reaching their destination, they behave like wild creatures all morning, shouting from the breezy bluffs, dashing down into the silvery marsh. As they break through the dewy cobwebs that glistened on the tall weeds, they taste nature's elixir as they throw themselves on their stomachs to drink the cool spring that flowed out from under the bank into the thatch of dark watercress. In the seclusion of the marsh, images of fertility and sexuality worthy of Whitman abound as the tall weeds and tan cattails stand erect and the wild roses spread wide open. The silvery milkweed is just coming on while the purple flowers of the blue-eyed grass lure darting birds and butterflies. Even a snake appears in this paradise, sunning itself on a tree stump. In their excited frenzy, the boys fill the air with noise and splashing. Having had their fill all at once, their excitement subsides as the breeze dies, the air swelters, and the marsh steams. In the afterglow, their shirts stick to their bodies and their hair to their forehead. After a vigorous day, their energy spent, they leave the steamy, sweltering marsh meadows for the grove and its clean grass. Unlike the boys who sheepishly ask to play in the marsh, Marian does not hesitate to join them. As the boys lie on the ground, exhausted, they see a white figure approaching rapidly down through the grove, uninhibited, bareheaded, her blue-black hair shining in the sun. When asked about their day, the boys respond, "We didn't fish much, just ran about." Without judgment or surprise, Marion exclaims, "I know, you were waiting and things." She confesses that she too likes to wade down there when she gathers flowers. She can't resist it, even though the water snake bites her toes. "I pull off my stockings," she says, "and pick up my skirts, and I go in." As she lifts her skirts before the boys, she thrusts out a white shoe and shook it. If she were in California, she said, she would even swim. Neil's encounters with nature, however, are less successful. During his afternoon at the marsh with the other boys, his effort to climb a tree to capture a wounded woodpecker fails. Neil straddles the trunk of the cottonwood only to find its bark rough against his legs. His first attempt to climb the tree is violent as the bark scratches his legs and tears his pants, leaving him breathless and fatigued. Just before he reaches into the hole to retrieve the bird, he loses his balance, turns a somersault in the air, and falls to the ground. With his broken arm, one of many symbolic castrations, according to Kathleen Nichols, Neil is carried to Marion's room, his body limp. The descriptions of this journey to the marsh and to Marion's bedroom are similar. To reach the marsh, the boys walk over the hill, through the grove, and down the bank. To reach Marion's bedroom, a passive Neil is carried through the butler's pantry, through the dining room, and through the back parlor to the dusky, half-darkened room. Purple flowers, milkweed, and wild roses welcome him in the marsh. A white bed with white linen and ruffled pillow shams await him in Marion's bedroom. In the marsh, he lay on his belly to drink from the cool spring. Now he rests passively on his back as the more experienced Marion kneels by his bed, putting brandy between his lips with a teaspoon and bathing his forehead with cologne. Neil associates Marion with the physical sensations awakened within him in the marsh. He feels the, quote, lovely lady's soft fingers as they run through his hair and her light kiss on his forehead. He sees her white throat rising and falling so quickly beneath the lace ruffle of her dress, and he smells her perfume. Like a rose, her scent entices him. Oh, how sweet she smelled. Neil's pleasure ends, however, when Dr. Dennison arrives and carries him away. For the next few years, Neil sees Marion infrequently. Like the marsh that overflows with life in the summer and is dormant in the winter, Marion was an excitement that came and went with the seasons. She and the captain leave Sweetwater soon after Thanksgiving and do not return until the 1st of May. Several years pass, yet the marsh remains irresistible to Neil, now a young man. One evening after a restless night, he is awakened before dawn by the puffing of the train's switch engine. He attempts to muffle his ears to repress his emotions, but the sound of the escaping steam for some reason excited him. He could not shut out the feeling that it was summer and that the dawn would soon be flaming gloriously over the forester's marsh. As he descends to the marsh, he finds the sky burning as the bowing grass, heavy with dew, rub against his knees. All over the marsh, plants are covered with dew, and the call of the birds is described as wet. The sunshine is wine-like and the meadows fragrant as a swamp weed spreads raspberry clusters. Yet amidst the sensuousness of nature, the adult Neil wishes to see the, quote, religious purity in the morning air. He attempts to see his surroundings as pure and unstained, even though they appeal to his physical senses. He wonders why he does not come to the marsh more frequently to see the day before men and their activities had spoiled it, while the morning was still unsullied. In his venture, Neil finds a thicket of wild roses with flaming buds just beginning to open. Once opened, their petals are stained with a burning rose color, a color that was always gone by noon, a dye made of sunlight and morning and moisture so intense that it cannot possibly last and must fade, like ecstasy. The sexual imagery of this passage belies the religious purity that Neil at least superficially embraces. In what Kathleen Nichols describes as a self-imposed castration, Neil cuts the rose's stiff stems. After cutting the stems and tying them together with meadow grass, again an effort to control nature, he reverts to his safe, idealized view of romance. He will leave the bouquet gathered off the cheeks of morning on Marian's window sill. He hopes that it will give her a sudden distaste for coarse worldlings like Frank Olinger, the 40-year-old bachelor from Denver visiting the Foresters. Neil passes through the grove on his way to Marian's bedroom, just as he did 7 years earlier. Yet this time, his romanticized view is crushed when he hears her impatient, indulgent, teasing, eager laughter and a man's fat, lazy laugh emanating from the bedroom. He soon finds himself at the foot of the hill, his face burning. Now the wild roses feel prickly in his hand as he throws them over the fence into a mud hole. Neil's admiration and loyalty for Marian, earlier compared to a bloom, is now gone, like the morning freshness of the flowers. The floral metaphor continues as he compares Marian to a lily. Lilies that fester, he mutters, lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds. Even though Marian is compared to various flowers throughout the novel, sometimes disparagingly, as Neil has just done, she does not always find comfort and relief in her surroundings. Nature may offer release for her pent-up vitality, yet there are times when it constrains her. The location of the house itself suggests the isolation she experiences in Sweetwater. The house, nearly a mile east of town, is covered with vines and surrounded by shrubbery, nestled into a cottonwood grove. Two creeks separate it from the road. Within this structure, removed from the marsh, surrounded by natural barriers, Marian often feels entombed. Her sense of confinement increases as nature creates even more obstacles for her the first winter she must spend in Sweetwater. The Foresters are snowed in as 30 inches of snow cover the dormant marsh and meadows, and the cutting wind blows it into whirling drifts. Marian struggles to survive, turning to sleep and alcohol. When given the opportunity, she escapes from the house and runs down the hill. As if in a tomb, she says she has been shut up too long. She feels as if she is dying, a state reflected in the natural conditions surrounding her. The town is buried beneath the snow. The poplars are lifeless like corpses, and they're stiff and blue, and the meadows are dormant. In a state of decline, Marian herself appears very pale with dark circles under her eyes. The snowstorm is followed by torrential rains, further isolating Marian. As the wide lake and the two rushing creeks overflow, separating the Foresters from the town. Neil attempts to reach the Forester place after the flood, only to discover the footbridge has also been washed away. Once again, Neil fails in his efforts to surmount the natural world. Marian, on the other hand, struggles with nature when she successfully battles the creek's overflowing waters in her effort to phone Frank Olinger after she discovers he has married. Determined, she crosses the river at night, appearing at Neil's door, her saturated dress like the wild roses Neil hurled into the ditch, covered with muddy pulp. Before Marian's arrival that evening, Neil is again at odds with nature, even within the solitude of his uncle's law office. The downpour has created disorder in his world. The continued rain had set one of the chimneys leaking, had brought down streams of soot and black water, and flooded the stove and the judge's once handsome Brussels carpet. The room was cold and damp. Marian's arrival only further disrupts his quiet monastic existence. She smells of strong spirits and creek mud and wet cloth, and she responds to Neil's question wildly. He attempts to reestablish order when he cuts the phone wire. After cutting the wire, another castration scene, according to Nichols, he cuts off Marian's clothes. The object of his desire, in a heavy stupor, lies undressed before him. Frightened, Neil covers her with his bathrobe, takes her in his bed, and locks the door. Before he leaves, he calls for his uncle and warns him of Miriam and her wild talk. He then sets out for the safer ground. He will spend the evening with Captain Forester, a man who in his youth controlled and mastered nature, a man who had put plains and mountains under the iron harness of the railroad, who had built hundreds of miles of road for the Burlington over sagebrush and cattle country and on up into the Black Hills, a feat in the eyes of a boy who could not climb a tree. After the captain's death, Neil pays one final visit to see Marion Forrester. On a warm summer evening, as he bends over to inhale the scent of the honeysuckle growing outside the Forresters' dining room window, he peers in and sees Ivy Peters place his arms around Marion's breasts. Neil leaves in disgust. Coming face to face for the second time with Marion's overt sexuality is more than he can bear. He rejects the woman who, quote, refused to die with a pioneer period to which she belonged. The woman who preferred life on any terms, who felt such a power, such a passion to live. Unable to accept or to control her passion, Neil leaves, never to return. But as the years passed, Daniel Forrester's wife returned to him, a bright, impersonal memory. She had, after all, had a hand in breaking him into life. At the novel's conclusion, the celibate Neil has yet to find the wild delight that Marion's laughing eyes alone suggest. Frustrated, he wishes to call up the shade of the young Mrs. Forrester to demand the secret of that ardor. He longs to ask if she had found some ever-blooming, ever-burning, ever-piercing joy, terms reminiscent of those used to describe the wild roses. Though Neil never exists in harmony with nature, even human nature, he never marries or experiences the feelings that drove Marion. He does come to accept, if not embrace, his long-lost lady. In the final pages, Neil honors Marion Forrester, returning once again to the floral imagery so prevalent throughout the novel. He writes, "She had always the power of suggesting things much lovelier than herself, as the perfume of a single flower may call up this whole sweetness of spring." Like the seasons, Neil comes full circle. He learns to accept in Marion what he cannot within himself. Years earlier, Neil intuited on some level Marion's innate passion and vitality when he gathered not white lilacs or old-fashioned blush roses, but wild burning with roses so intense that they must fade like ecstasy. As he comes to accept her all too human character, Neil's view of the flowers change. The defiled flower, what he described as the festering lily, fades from his memory, and once again, Marion becomes his wild rose. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth. Next on the agenda, we'll do Q&A at the very end. We have Susan Vanderborg from the University of South Carolina, who will talk about Spectacularizing Debt in Kentucky Route Zero, interactive fiction's staged gameplay.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to do a quick screen share so you can see a few of the images from the game. Okay, fantastic. Well, the theme of debt is really well recognized in the haunting interactive fiction Kentucky Route Zero, 2013-2020. It's a surreal portrait of an Appalachian region whose residents are chronically in debt to the power company. This paper focuses on the game's interrogation of debt as pleasurable media spectacle. What happens in revisiting DuBois' Society of the Spectacle through the lens of interactive fiction, where the audience is already caught between the passive reading of pre-written text paths, now often with entrancing visuals, and the illusion of a gential participatory play? I look at the guilty pleasures and impoverishing oversights in the game's debt spectacles to ask for a post-situationist generation where it might suggest new forms of resistance for future interactive fictions. If Bataille's gift economy is based on the sun's overflowing energy, this game's debt economies, as you can tell from the pictures, are night-bound, the better to be illuminated by garish neon signs or flickering TV screens. Okay, the lure of the spectacles in Kentucky Route Zero it is the way they sensationalize structures of indebtedness, not only in vistas, whole vistas of decaying machinery, but in bodies with flesh stripped from bones, since for debt victims, the power company doesn't take a pound of flesh for the entirety, forcing debtors to work for the affiliated Hard Times distillery as glowing orange skeletons, like anthropomorphic work caution signs. Debt spectacles here being simultaneously spectral, rendering shapelessly anonymous the subjects they supposedly illumine. These spectral worker spectacles replicate their own images virally, since the work is magically brewing debt itself as a liquidating commodity to be infused in the whiskey, deadening anyone who drinks it. The kegs are shaped like coffins. Can the game's interactions, can interactive fiction more generally, interrupt or critique the spectacle? Resisting spectacularization is not futile in the game, but also not simple. Our choices, as critics have frequently noted, are unusually circumscribed in this piece and don't necessarily affect key outcomes. While we can control to an extent what we choose to see or see first and how to react to it in a particular scene, visualization is always problematic. In one of the interludes, an artist's day-turning remediations of abandoned debt machines are displayed in an exhibition attended by possibly dead spectators, a reminder of how easily such subversions can themselves become overfamiliar, deadening spectacles that these spectators sleepwalk through with banal comments. Okay, let's see. I've chosen for this paper's focus not one of the main acts in the purchase game, but one of the free interludes called immediately for a light Edwardian reading, The Entertainment. This is what the characters in this bar scene are interminably waiting for here. This is the bar in the lower depths. Not for a meaning-giving God/Godot, but some audio-visual escapist distraction, even if the promise isn't delivered here in the interlude, but only in an act of the main game, by a team of android musicians who seem more alive and individuated than the humans, with the song message that it's too late for love. Or is the day spectacular people-watching entertainment, as customer Evelyn says? The detached glee of seeing exasperated daughter Pearl cut off her deadbeat parents from any more support toward their bar tab? But as a shift of the mouse reveals, the bar patrons are themselves the entertainment, actors on a stage set being viewed by equally faceless spectators, like a blanker parody of the 1983 translated Society of the Spectacle cover. The play is also being assessed in-game by less than impressed reviewers. The entertainment's meta reveal of that it's a stage acknowledges the way Appalachia, as Jay Sharp notes about the game's setting choice, has so often been turned into a spectacle, poverty porn, euphemized here as, quote, local cultural history by one in-game reviewer, provoking a pleasant, facile recognition and pity with no action to change anything. Even the fictional set designer in the game, complaining about the playwright's sparse instructions for setting, uses the word, quote, poetic to describe their scantiness, poverty, descriptive and literal, being aestheticized again. The premise of this supposedly free entertainment also raises the issue of the spectacle's hidden costs. I teach this text because it's free. The full interactive fiction game would cost each student $25. But free drinks in the infernal lower depths are hardly free once we realize that all the whiskey is debt infused. So the bartender buying the departing Pearl a free drink may not be making a kind gesture, but more corporate entrapment. Just this free play interlude is great advertising, enough to interest some reader players in buying the rest of the game. But I also choose it because, as the fan wiki rightly notes, it's one of the most tightly constrained game sections. It's even a question of whether it can truly be called either game or interactive fiction on its own. In the main acts, however little it affects the game's outcome, we can at least choose among a list of dialogue lines for a character and sometimes actions. In the entertainment, agency is limited to simply where in the scene we pan over to, revealing preset dialogue or play notes. The fictional theater critics complain the dialogue itself is far too stiff, limiting what the actors can do, and the review quotes are superimposed on the fictional audience as if their, or is it our, reactions to the spectacle should be pre-programmed. It's no coincidence that the Feely for this part of the game is a traditional linear paperback copy of the play, or rather two plays combined, A Reckoning and A Barfly, both by the fictional Lem Doolittle, both heavily indebted to other plays about despondent cast-offs from O'Neill, Beckett, Gorky, not a collective lineage that bodes well for the chance of a change in spectacle subject, even if the locations ostensibly differ. Our cribbing playwright Doolittle in the main game is no magical animal whisperer, no revolutionary worker. No, he's the skeleton PR employee who gives a tour of the brewery, Spectacular enough to convince one of the protagonists in the main game to drink the whiskey and be forced to join the workforce. And his first name, Lem, as in Stanisław Lem, creator of robot protagonists and spectacular gadgets that inform, advertise, and entertain, even as they overwhelm and bury their users. Finally, the character perspective we're confined to, tellingly, is the anonymous barfly drunk with no lines and, quote, a pantomime. And it wasn't even supposed to be included with the main play's entertainment. And the play segment with verbal interactions between characters, notwithstanding the red exit sign on a far wall, all our mouth shifts portray only the lack of exit for us and the patrons of this lower bar, the lower depths bar, where the Hard Times whiskey is now the only purchasable liquid entertainment. But if we can't escape, and by the way, that's too low, if we can't escape, what we're forced to watch is the creation of the spectacle. The board's book on a page with visuals of skeletons and costume hats notes the spectacle's function is to make history forgotten within culture. The spectacles in the entertainment are artful erasures, co-opting the local, which is the word Harry uses to advertise the whiskey. Instead of giving actual local history clues, how exactly did the consolidated electric company consolidate its power? The Hard Times Served sign on the wall suggests via its responsibility dodging passive voice in served, a term that shifts from serving refreshment to debt servitude labor, that residents' struggles are a normal, perpetual part of the landscape as the board's continual present, happily offered as regional fare within and beyond its fourth wall. As the playwright says, quote, we revere the pains of the audience. What specifically can we read here painfully in the spectral locality or the locals? The dim overhead light on owner Harry's face foregrounds a blank angularity. It was a Hard Time Served. This is all we can see of Harry. Instead of a readable history of worry lines, we can only discern gray hair and a harsh trapezoid outcrop from his forehead, his ear rectangle. Jordan Reiki wrote that it looks like they're all cobbled together by geometric shapes. What is most legible is what's vanishing. His arms, already skeletally thin. Many of KRZ's characters are similarly emaciated. And these proto-spectacles of capitalistic debt were starving, even as we frantically consume. And if the spectacle, as Debord says, attenuates relations between people, here the characters' voices are unintelligible garbles, not the Sims chirpy clips with dissonant, faintly menacing sounds, intelligible only as caption box words on the screen. Within these boxes, Harry talks about a phantom vacation on a beach, or is it a motel pool? Shifting iconic images of American getaways. He can't quite decide on the preferred spectacle as covers for bankruptcy and betrayal. In the process of becoming skeleton, we see a Black family denied promotions, the dangled promise, quote, maybe eventually, of a better supermarket or pawn shop position among newer recycled commodity consumption isn't even given the alliterative grace of Hughes's dream deferred. The daughter's hope of escape to American final frontiers in a spectacular California, sounding as ersatz as Harry's vacation. Perhaps anticipated by the unintelligible audio, we see the patrons misread casualties for causes, blaming their fellow debt sufferers as, quote, parasites and sponges, while their biblical language, including Harry's blended economic and holy avengement warning, quote, there will be a reckoning, projects the image of consolidated electric power as God, omnipotent and uncriticizable, the new spectacle's religious allusion. To cite Debord, the final reveal that Harry, in order to stay in business, has sold all his customers' debt to Hard Times, whose skeletons will promptly come to take them away at the end of this interlude, underscores the irony of that spectacular misreading or non-reading. If, for example, the reckoning is an Isaiah 10:3 allusion, the original context is a divine judgment against those who deprive and defraud the poor. Debord was very well aware of the potential co-optation of spectacle critique. What's needed for real change, he wrote, is, quote, the resumption of revolutionary class struggle. But no revolution seems possible here. If a recognition of history is the prerequisite for revolution, we're playing this game as the barfly who repeatedly, quote, struggles to remember even the past few minutes. Like the skeletons, he doesn't speak himself, they need tape reels, he gets stage directions, descriptions for his thoughts and actions. In the last ones, we're told a sentence is typically stripped of an agential subject pronoun. The character, quote, glances down at newspaper, tries to be interested, sighs, shuffles, surrenders, not promising for revolution. It's surely not enough to just control what we see when trapped, mute, and relegated to someone else's parenthetical directives. And yet, there's a reason the back of the paperback play features a drawing of a pair of wearable spectacles, i.e. glasses, so they're folded up here, not yet put on. A key part of the process of becoming skeleton in this play is an inability Or is it a tacit shared refusal to see the end results? Quote, you ever see, and then ellipsis, ... one of them. The boys from Hard Times, Evelyn hesitantly asks Harry. I heard there, again, 3 dots, pause, strange. Suspenseful or weary ellipsis runs through most of the game's dialogue lines, ellipsis signifying words omitted but understood in context. The familiar boys defamiliarize at the same time they are throughout the game not seen as, or at least not openly acknowledged as, the skeletons we see on our screen, simply referred to as the strangers, undead examples of a strange alienated labor and autonomy, the not us to be not talked about beyond the defensive, quote, they work hard, that maintains an illusion of agency and impact, or indeed rhetorically blames their condition on themselves, quote, who are we to judge? We protest that their spectacular spectral fate couldn't happen to us even as we've joined their ranks. The deified company depends on a belief in the absence of seen alternatives to its debt servitude economy, but the game offers, if not fully realized escape paths, at least glimpses of a different kind of economy and service dissemination. This interlude, as I've suggested, has a tense relationship between debt and gift, but it's technically free to view online. If you want now a paper and ink copy of the script, you pay a small fee, $4.50 plus $4.94 in shipping and handling. In return, you get a mini situationist détournement, not of a glossy ad spectacle, but a familiar legal economic paratext. Online, the bottom of the entertainment page has a standard notice, copyright 2013, Cardboard Computer, LLC, all rights reserved. Language echoed them clicking on the Lulu Products website for the script purchase. But when the print copy arrives, it contradicts them with a copy it right page that eschews copyright protection and says all rights to any performance and reproductions are freely granted. Copy it right is a direct debt, as Sharp notes. A quote from video artist Phil Morton's 1970s counter-faith reworking of indebtedness. His quote, distributed religion of freely copied images, and it anticipates, I would add, anticipates the open source movement, and I'd add more specifically the copyleft agreement of the Free Software Foundation, a direct rebuke to the entertainment's description of debt as, quote, new technology. The copy it right reference Sharp cites is an in-game one, but here it's embodied in physical format outside the computer screen in the paper booklet, albeit ambiguously outside. The booklet never breaks character, authorship still attributed to Doolittle, though Cardboard Dramatic Publishing is given a local Chicago address. So is this largesse legal in the real world? Its production process and value is interrogatable at a specific site. Even if the gift delivery is in line with the spectacle, more appearance and actuality in this instance, and this is a game based on trying to make a delivery to an elusive address, it's a reminder of how many IF works are available in full for free play online in the interactive fiction database, the electronic literature collection volumes. It's not a full substitute economy, and our own interactions in these alternative gift economies and dissemination methods are perhaps a key part of the interactivity that needs to be interrogated, with better methods of tipping, support for independent companies, and support for text designers. KRZ notably had to be developed through Kickstarter crowdfunding with a slow games development, Ricky Jordan notes, further estranging that economic infrastructure. If the spectacle is never the distracting imagery, however seductive its associative gameplay, but the interactions among people, as DeBoard said, what relational economies are we willing to critique, sabotage, or rebuild for the participatory fictions we value? Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much, Susan. Finally, we have Jason Wang of Toronto Metropolitan University, who will speak on the financial crisis and home ownership in Jade Chang's The Wangs versus the World.
Thank you so much, Adrian, and thank you also for the organizers of the Louisville Conference on Literature and Culture. And a hybrid form of the conference always takes a lot of effort, so thank you so much. And thank you also, Beth and Susan, for your two wonderful papers. And I hope I can continue this discussion about the backdrop American dream and also the speculative nature of that in Susan's presentation. So I want to start my talk with a brief quote. The Wangs had fallen so far, so fast. Jade Chang writes in her 2016 novel, The Wangs versus the World. The novel depicts the personal crisis and the sudden fall down of Charles Wang, a self-made immigrant in Los Angeles who is forced to return to humble beginnings. The novel's focus is on the 2008 financial crisis, which started with the collapse of the Lehman Brothers investment firm and causing a debt crisis. Hundreds of thousands suffered dramatic failure with the foreclosure of houses and the mass loss of jobs. In Chang's novel, after losing his business and all assets in September 2008, Charles Wang embarks on a cross-country family trip on the Interstate 10 highway from California to New York. This trip is a key element of Chang's experimentation on the finance fiction genre in American literary tradition, which she subjects a radical social critique exposing the destructive consequences not only of the financial crisis, but also the mystification of American dream of home ownership. Specifically, I argue that Chang's novel subverts the social norms of home ownership that is naturalized in the American economic discourse and in finance fictions. She does so by deploying a road trip as a tactical metaphor, while also critically engaging themes of immigration and family that are often absent in the finance fictions. Ultimately, Chang's experimental subversion consists in revamping the concept of home in the wake of a 2008 financial crisis through themes of ethnicity, immigration. And this makes her novel part of the genealogies of experimental fiction that is focus of our panel today. So before I move to the novel, I consider the scholarship on literary representations of economic crisis. The scholarship is focused almost exclusively on fictions by white and mostly male American authors, such as Theodore Dreiser's The Financier, Tom Wolfe's The Bonfire of Vanities, and Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho. This scholarship critiques the monetary obsession as highlighted by the role of the financier as a manipulative and even malicious agent. For example, Arnie de Beauvoir's 2018 book, Finance Fictions, Realism and Psychosis in a Time of Economic Crisis, points to the limits of realism in conceptualizing modern finance. De Beauvoir argues that American finance fiction as a genre is unable to capture the dynamics of a financial capitalism in the 20th and the 21st centuries. He writes, quote, the speculative operations of finance make human beings disavow existing reality. Thus, in order to write the reality of finance today, one may have to turn to experimental rather than realistic writing. Likewise, literary scholar Alison Schunkweiler, Lee Claire LeBerg, and Annie McLanahan pursue similar arguments. Collectively, they argue that traditional realistic novels of finance ultimately distracts or even betrays the readers, leaving them without alternatives. Then suggest that to successfully address the mystification of abstraction in financial crisis, it is essential to experiment with the form of the finance fiction. So in the following, I will be drawing on these scholars who have opened a space for me to consider possibilities. I propose that there is an opportunity to expand the genre of finance fiction to include financial crisis fiction with its concrete focus on the social dimensions, addressing an important gap. In following, I will show how Chang's novel mediates finance with its invisible operations under the social reality, in other words, the visible. I suggest that Chang's novel succeeds in this mediation by focusing on the concept of home ownership during the 2008 financial crisis. And ultimately, the novel critiques the fetishization of home ownership in everyday American economic life and the discourse. Chang's novel begins with a Wang family losing their ostentatious Bel Air mansion in the celebrity neighborhood of Los Angeles after a business expansion fails and the bank calls in its loan in early September 2008. The owner of the collapsing cosmetic empire that marks the successful Asian immigrant myth, Charles Wang embarks on a road trip, picking up kids at school in Santa Barbara and Phoenix. Their goal is to meet Charles's oldest daughter in upstate New York. While the trip seems entirely unnecessary, the family could have flown the distance it is clear that it stands for something else during the crisis. Indeed, it is in the car, a 1980 model of Mercedes station wagon, that the family gathers and interacts, while the Bel Air luxury home is typically deserted. On the trip, the family crowd together and confront the impact of the financial crisis all around. As Chang writes, all across the country, one by one, foreclosed house by shuttered business. In cold bedrooms and empty boardrooms, cars turned into homes. People had the same thoughts. This cross-American trip of Chang's novel draws on the road trip genre. It also subverts it profoundly. In median scholar David Letterman's words, the road trip genre often oscillates between a rebellious critique of conservative authority and a reassertion of a traditional expansionist and colonial ideology. In contrast, Chang's novel offers critiques through a perspective of an Asian immigrant family on the road. Instead of exploration and rebellion, the Wang family's road trip begins to reconfigure the idea of home after losing the home ownership, then domesticate the car as a family sphere. Instead of a foreground in financial operations as shown in other finance fictions, Chang's narrative is haunted by the recession, a point illustrated by a minor figure in the novel, an adjunct economic professor at the Arizona State University, where then pick up Chang's son, Andrew. The economic professor is an immigrant from the former Soviet Union, and he enters the lecture hall holding up a copy of the Wall Street Journal with the headline, US to take over AIG in 85 billion payout, one of the largest payouts during the crisis. The professor rants, real estate, that's our present delusion. More than that, mortgages, because a mortgage is never just a mortgage, is it? It's a promise that your life can change. What is a promise like that but your world-famous American dream? The target of his attack is the speculative nature of the American finance system, which abstracts the reality of risk and debt, while promising a romanticized narrative of ownership. The language of ownership is a part of the speculative nature of the capitalist finance system. And this abstraction is often hidden in the language of art, as seen in Theodore Dreiser's 1912 novel, The Financier, where the protagonist financier calls his business as the wonder of his financial and artistic and future social dreams. And more recently, in Donald Trump's The Art of a Deal, correlating art and with the so-called business success and the business secrets. In Chang's novel, such a parallel of art is also invoked by the successful artist's daughter, who says, quote, in a way, finance was even better than art. It was nothing but an expression of a potential, of power, and of our present moment in time. So indeed, the discourse of ownership reflects a model of what culture theorist Mark Fisher calls business ontology, in which everything in society, including healthcare and education, should be run as a business. And this business ontology has infiltrated all aspects of Charles's life. He even sees his children as his property, as seen when his son, Andrew, has a love affair and decides to end the road trip and stayed in New Orleans. Charles' response is, Andrew did not leave, Andrew was stolen. Caught in the dominated discursive framework of ownership. So, but when they arrived in New York, Charles is unable to let his desperate quest to recuperate home as a property. He embarks on yet another journey, traveling to Beijing to reclaim the family land, which was confiscated by the Chinese Communist Party during the 1950s land reform movement. Persisting in his mode of speculation, Charles is insistent on wanting to rebuild the home by reclaiming his father's ancestral property in China, even though Charles himself was born in Taiwan and had never set foot in mainland China. As for the context, in 2008, in the wake of the global financial crisis, Chinese government introduced the largest stimulus package in the world with its strong state-controlled banking system and the large foreign reserves. China had escaped the worst of the financial crisis, being the first major economy in the world to recuperate from the global recession. But for Charles, the trip to China turns out to be another speculative delusion, revealing his alienation from the country. Like many immigrants living in diaspora, Charles's business and financial failures trigger a nostalgic cultural longing in which he speculates on imagined redemption in China. And this nostalgia is a strategic need for Charles, a necessary spiritual space for consolation for his American failure, but instead reveals its dangerously speculative character. So not surprisingly, the novel culminates in his final breakdown. In the final chapter, Charles Wang wakes up from a small stroke in a Beijing hospital, surrounded by his wife and the children who have rushed in from the United States. When opening his eyes in the bed, he proclaims, "Daddy discovered America," meaning that America is his home, not China. His family is in America. He has also reached a new understanding of America. The novel ends with these lines. He leans back, exhausted. Later, then we'll learn how to rule the new world. But for now, this is enough. This is everything. In the end, Chang's novel, The Wangs versus the World, recasts the concept of home, critically deconstructing the illusion of American home ownership, tethered to what the novel exposes as an irresponsible financial system. The cross-country road trip prompts question of what it means to be an immigrant family and to create a home and identity in America. By experimenting with established American genres, notably the finance fiction and the novel of road trip, Chang subverts American values regarding finance and ownership, thus generating new questions about how to move forward. What stands out is her critique of the American finance system and the literary genres from the perspective of a Chinese immigrant who has become trapped by it, but ultimately recuperates home as a space for family. I also want to add that unlike most finance fictions which portray financier as an anti-hero, Chang's novel takes a comic turn by creating human and likable characters, each with their own vulnerabilities and idiosyncrasies. With her focus on the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis and the most serious financial crisis since the 1929 Great Depression, Chang succeeds in expanding the finance fiction by putting the accent on the crisis, shining the light on the humanity, often obscured by finance fiction and swallowed by the finance itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So we have a big chunk of time for Q&A because we have until 5 p.m. Eastern. So just open it up. And people can put questions in the chat or raise your hand, or we're a small enough group that we can also just.
All right, I'll start. I'll ask a question to Jason. It was interesting. I mean, in one way, all three presentations take up questions of work and survival and success, I guess you'd say. With Jason, with your analysis of the Wang's novel, I was listening intently, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what you see as sort of the critique payoff of the novel as how you talked about business ontology. Does it, where does the novel leave us on that kind of issue?
Oh yeah, thanks so much, Matthew, for the question. A little bit of background of the finance fiction. Most of the finance fiction very much focus on the identity of the financier. So a lot of theorists and literary critique have long argued that the limitation of realistic novels in actually portraying the language of the highly changing dynamics of the globalized financial system. So their argument is that a lot of finance fictions failed to address or fail to provide an alternative or imagination to the finance system. But I think Jade Chang's novel does slightly different or radically different in my perspective. In this is instead of focusing on the crisis through the literacy of the finance or trying to explain how finance work, the novel very much focuses on the everyday consequences of the recession and the global financial crisis. And I think the most successful part is the novel changes narratives. I often say like the novel changes the understanding or change the sense of the home from the home ownership to creating a kind of sphere for family itself. And of course, for me, like for example, the road trip initially, I was like, why do they need this road trip? Because the oldest daughter still has this the trust fund that they could easily fly from Los Angeles to New York. But then the road trip itself is through this almost like firsthand witnessing of the everyday consequence of financial crisis. And this is, I think, what I would like to argue, that a fiction like this or any kind of a creative and imaginative work actually is able to mediate between the complex a financial system with the kind of a visible social and cultural consequences that the crisis has brought into.
Gotcha. Well, we can talk more about that, but I see there's a question in the chat, Andrea.
Yeah, Susan asked.
Why Kentucky?
Oh wait, before you jump in, let me just read it aloud because I know not everyone may have access to the chat. This is, I assume this is Brandon, who's asking this. I was wondering why you think that the game designer thought Kentucky would be such a great setting to show the way that debt traps and even questions about our reliance upon systems that might entrap us. Secondly, the game concludes in a way that suggests that there might be hope to break out of such a system, doesn't it? Although with the surrealism that might be more cynical than literal. And then Brandon said, great paper, by the way, I loved it.
Okay, great. I'm not sure I've thought about Kentucky specifically, although there are some things sort of at stake there. Definitely the whole Appalachia question has been thoroughly hashed over, and it's a very deliberate, posing of sort of the turning of the local into spectacle. And the game designers are clearly trying to play against it. And the big question for reviewers is, does this simply remediate old narratives that, this region is afflicted by debt? Here we see all this, in the bar, we see all the struggling patrons. We see the effects of it, not in, and I love Jason's presentation of this, not in an individualized, way with sort of unique individuals, but reduced to sort of stereotypes. And with the drawings the way they are, that's a very that's a pertinent question. And again, they are critiquing it, but it is so easy to fall back into it. And again, there are so many routes to the indebtedness, and Pynchon, again, they transport a lot of Pynchon's themes from the California setting, though I think that's one of the things that comes in with Pearl's desire to escape to California. Into Kentucky. I want to hear your thoughts on where you thought the Kentucky choice in particular was going. As for the conclusion, yes, we finally make the delivery. We find that, it is this, that dogwood drive. And again, I touched on Doolittle not being the magical animal whisperer, but we could just talk about the animal symbols throughout the play, and throughout the multiple acts of this text. But yeah, and it's now our new home, and the delivery of this antiquated furniture, and again, nostalgia, and is nostalgia a trap, another spectacle, or is it something that, as Ricky Jordan argues, can slow down and resist the pace of capitalist consumption, is another question. But yeah, it's our house now, or this sort of half-finished thing, and we can furnish it now with all of the stuff that we were trying to find. We've lost Conway. He succumbed to his debt addiction and alcoholism, and he's drinking the Kool-Aid or the whiskey and working in the Hard Times Distillery. But we're slightly off the beaten path. I don't know. The company kind of flooded this place. It is hard to read. In other words, the ending seems hopeful, and I think that is great. And do we need to interrogate that based on the rest of the game? Probably a little. Again, I want to hear your good thoughts both on Kentucky and what you thought of the ending.
I'll turn on real fast. So I actually kind of found a very common theme that we see in American video games, where it's almost like a libertarian dream, where you get to do everything yourself and everything's fine, and all of this that you're fighting against the whole time, you almost seem freed from it. And not everyone does, but because you're in control and you're good at this, you get it done. So I don't find it so hopeful at the end, but yeah. I thought they're trying to convince me that it's hopeful.
I know, but I think that the game asks you to be skeptical. I mean, isn't the town flooded partly because of what the power company did? I mean, How long is this going to remain off the beaten track? They're going to find them. The skeletons are going to show up, or they're going to start shipping bottles of the whiskey in there. I think it asks you to really interrogate the seeming sort of happy ending, and we've certainly sort of had the cost of what that moment in time where there seems to be the possibility of being temporarily outside the system. I don't think they're suggesting it's going to be permanent.
Right. Yeah. No, that's how I feel too.
And some commentators have talked about the importance of the narratives and whether or not at least you get to tell your own story about the debts and indebtedness. And if that counts, if that mediates against falling back into stereotypes about the late of Kentucky. And again, some of the settings, I talked about the plays he's indebted to, and the settings seem to be diverse, but there's so much that he is, again, transporting, like the Echo River, which echoes Narcissus and Echo stuff in the pension, and
no, I think that's really cool. And there's also like this Dante-esque sort of journey. It's really cool. Yeah, and thank you for the paper. It's really, really awesome.
And Jason, I love the way you were talking about the debt economy from a different perspective and how the home ownership functions because of that. Of course, that is, one of the illusions that Kentucky Route Zero seems to be. It's not exactly ownership. It's a space outside the system, but how long before the system catches up with them? I don't know that. And again, Beth, your amazing questions sort of about the setting and the setting reflected. Well, what happens when the setting has been completely strip mined and what do we do at a stage in American fiction where that lushness and that resource and that sexual energy is so intruded upon and so regulated? It becomes a question.
Beth, did you want to respond to that? I didn't know if that was a question or a comment.
What interested me so much was again that Jason, that our works are more contemporary, and that going back to Cather, and as we look back on this, would this kind of narrative be possible about American dreams, American liberations? Would it be possible in this Cather being today, or how would how would, writers have to sort of respond to that idea of the landscape?
Well, I can just answer from Cather's perspective. She sets up the contrast between Captain Forrester, who, in a sense, took control of the land. He took the Burlington Railroad into areas where it had not been. The way he met Marion is she was up in the mountains and she fell, and I believe she broke both her legs, and they had to carry her. And she said she always felt safe when Captain Forrester was carrying her, and eventually she reached her assistance. But when the bank fails, in which he had large ownership and had encouraged a lot of the laborers who had worked for him, had invested their money. The younger men who were also owners of that bank said, let's not, we'll only pay a certain percentage. And he said, no, I'm going to pay them back their full amount. They won't lose a penny. So he cashed in all of his bonds and so forth. And then he and Marion were left in more financial straits than anyone else. But it's a contrast between Captain Forrester and the upcoming generation. He was the old pioneer who had conquered the land, who had taken the railroad, but he also embraced it. He didn't, for example, drain the marsh on his land because the beauty of it. Whereas when Ivy Peters comes in, if you've read the novel, he's a despicable character. He's an attorney, and but he, after Captain Forrester dies and he's helping Marion, he drains the marsh. So just a contrast between that previous generation that Neil felt Marion should have gone with, and then that up and coming generation, which more focused on money and self and that type of thing. So.
And again, as you said, that's such a contrast between what he decides to do with the prospect of debt, and that it stops at, the bank head, and it stops at the shareholders, and they're the ones who should take the hit rather than the workers.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we've come away.
And their life changes completely after he honors the debt and takes care of the people who had invested solely based on his name alone. So it showed him as an admirable man, though it certainly did not help him personally in his finances.
I'm curious if this is part of larger projects for the three of you, how this fits into a larger research project or teaching project.
I just enjoy Willa Cather, so and I just saw the common theme running throughout with the flowers and nature and Marion and Neil and their different interactions with it. And so maybe a paper down the road, but right now it was just something that an observation, so I just put it into a presentation. And when I teach the novel, we talk about these various symbols and that type of thing.
I can go next. This is the first time I'm teaching in an American Lit survey, one of those ones that starts with, with Roger Williams, A Key into America, and it's about homelands, construction of homelands, who's included, who's excluded, and I thought it would be interesting to do a segment on Appalachia. We do a huge children's lit segment, and how Appalachia is portrayed in children's books versus Kentucky Route Zero. What's going on with issues of who owns the landscape, who owns the homeland. But I'd also love to, at some point turn it into a paper. I mean, it's amazing the amount of scholarship that already exists on this, on the game. Jason, what about you?
I have two aspects of in my answer. The first is, as I briefly mentioned in my paper, that it just through like a very simple observation, I find that most of the writers and the scholars who write about the 2008 financial crisis, they are very much like American male white authors. So that's a question often comes to my mind. Even the 4 scholarship, the 4 books I mentioned in my book, those books all published after Chang's novel got published. My question, why this novel was not included in a scholarship like this, that was more like the scholarly side of reason why I started this project. The second is I often want to study issues that I could not understand years before. For example, 9/11 and also the financial crisis. I was quite young. At that time, I knew there are things going on in the world, but I couldn't really fathom what's actually going on. And especially issues or events like the 9/11 and also the financial crisis, even the adults in my life at that time could not fully explain what's going on. So I think now at my later stage, like older self, I'm trying to deconstruct what confused me at that point. I think that's a more personal kind of reason to start a project like this.
And I'm fascinated too, because your paper tackled both the revision of the sort of financier genre, but also the revision of the road trip. And I can't help thinking of Jack Kerouac and how this is such again a very different take on it. And it strikes me that the economy, the beat economy, and how the characters, get money from various family members, but they seem to have this perpetual ability to just go on the road and get fed by somebody or get picked up as a hitchhiker. How did you see it really tackling some of the same problems and prejudices built within the road trip genre?
Mm-hmm. So the conventional legacy of the road trip genre, it's very much kind of either in the early kind of more colonial kind of a mindset. It's like, oh, let's explore the great American land, or it's more of the Beat generation. It's more about this rebellions kind of a critique on the more conservative authorities. And I think this novel really kind of keep distant from this kind of a too conventional tradition of a road trip genre. It's interesting that the road trip, the first is more of a documentation or witness of the crisis, and the second is more focusing on the building, or what I call it, the domesticating the car as a space, as a mobile home to kind of reconstruct or reconfigure the concept of the home, and it detached from home ownership. And even the car is a second-hand car, belonged to Charles' first wife, which was given to the nanny of Charles, and then the nanny returned them as a little gift because during this difficult time. And that's what I feel, that the road trip helps reconfigure the concept of the home a little bit, because the most of the discourse surrounding about a house or home is very much tailored towards the finance literacy, right? Like that's why the major points of the financial crisis, the subprime mortgage crisis, and as well. So but Susan, your words on the strike me as well, which is you says in your paper and in your answer, I think you both mentioned to make the local into spectacle. I think that's also tailored towards this home ownership as well, right? Like all those buildings and rebuildings, and trying to create a market for it. I have two small quick questions for you. It was really fascinating paper that you mentioned about the game. The first mini question is what do you think the narrative in a video game is able to achieve that a conventional fiction is unable to achieve? And the second question, probably is a little bit far stretch, is what happened if the true age of the metaverse happen? The problem you diagnose in the video game will be still a problem at that point or not?
If we get to a full metaverse, yes, then we'll need the cautionary examples that some of this interactive fiction and gaming suggests. And I'm smiling because I'm the outside reader for a high school senior exhibition on what can these games give us that conventional narratives don't. And again, there's so many ways to answer that, both in commonalities, that it is not quite as revolutionary as it looks. And in fact, my book arts class, we're doing a unit on cybertext in print. And, you know, the choose your own adventure genre, and how the game, in other words, this idea of multiple paths isn't unique to the game. But so I think we have to look at some of the things that the video medium can do, or interactive fiction can do. And in some ways, the game is great, because not only is there all this very, very overt literary indebtedness, like the bar is called The Lower Depths, which is the Gorky play, and they're, you know, I mean, they're completely over the top about everything they're borrowing, but they do that with the games too. And when you get the computer in the cave that the Xanadu up and running, you can play an old-fashioned text adventure. So it asks us to go back to the origins of game development in a way that, again, takes us out of just the immediate fascination with the spectacle. It makes us think critically, okay, why did it take this directive? And then what are some specific things, like cut scenes, like blackouts, like glitching screens? What are some unique possibilities that a game can do that, yeah, I mean, for example, so many of them now are visual, and that's a change too. Text adventures used to be, I mean, like, or even Emily Short's Galatea follows that old-fashioned cave model. And by the way, I'm sure the Kentucky caves, so Brandon, one answer to your question, I'm positive the Kentucky caves are a shout out to Cave in the original adventure. You know, that's part of it, because so much of this is situated in Kentucky caves. What can the genre do uniquely? And there are some things that you can look at, things that, and you know, how our experience is different. For example, how is replaying different than rereading? There are all kinds of really interesting questions. And in some way, Nick Montfort raises this question of replaying when he compares interactive fiction to a riddle game or a riddle poem. He said that even when you solve the riddle, there should be something compelling enough about the language so that there's a point in replay, or there's a point in more world development. And you know, I'm sure Nick Montfort would say world development is one of the things that we can do, that we can either with visuals or with the text alone, we can do this marvelous world development. Ricky Jordan might say, and that allows us to slow things down, which, you know, queer avant-garde game critics have talked about as a way to destabilize this masculinist, linear shoot 'em up narratives that a lot of commercial games have available. I think, you know, we also get to, like I said, I think it is a different economy. I'm amazed that, you know, most of them have day jobs, but look at the interactive fiction database. You go on there and you can play a lot of that stuff, at least online, for free. And it gets you thinking about what would a gift economy actually look like? Are there ways outside of some of the models of publishing and copyright that we think of as completely set? So again, there are just so many things that games can potentially do. I don't think they always do it. And in some ways, indie games are great because they say it doesn't all have to be like these mainstream fares. And if you want me to say where IF leaves off and a game begins, I don't know. I don't know that I have a hard line for that. Did that answer some of your questions? And wait a minute, your second one, can you go through the second one you said with the metaverse? Like I said, one of the things that games do, and games like this do, that I think some of the mainstream ones don't always, is talk about the illusion of participation in a way that makes very clear when you have, and I think of this with Porpentine's games as well, you don't, in many cases, change the outcome. And there are games that the interactive fictions that really tend to foreground that and ask us then, if the illusion of agency in any interactive fiction, whether it's in print or online, you know, is less than it would seem if we're still constrained to what the author, you know, the number of paths the author additionally wrote. And he was like Emily Short with Galatea writing, like, what was it, 70 different endings? Then what do we do within those constraints? Maybe that's a way to approach if the metaverse really takes over. What can we do with the constraints that we are handed us? What can we do with the realization that our participation is caught up in fueling these debt spectacles and these systems we don't necessarily support. So maybe it's useful for that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I really like the idea you mentioned about the word making, and I think this also goes back to the financial crisis is that a lot of fictional representations fails to address this, which goes back to Mark Fisher's kind of capitalist realism. Like there's no alternative. It's almost become a cliche that whatever you're trying to represent such a finance system, but maybe a case like like you said, the indie avant-garde game is able to give this experimental space for award making and make the resistance more forceful and more meaningful. Yeah. Thank you, Susan.
Other questions or comments? All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for great presentation.